Clara never thought her marriage would end like this. She had given Daniel more than 10 years of her life. She had supported him when his business was small, and she had stood beside him when things went wrong. She cooked his meals, washed his clothes, and cared for him every day. To her, he was not just a husband, he was her whole world. But Daniel had changed. Lately, he had been distant, leaving home early and returning late at night. When she asked him where he had been, he would snap at her, saying she was too controlling. Clara ignored the signs at first, telling herself that he was only tired from work. Deep inside, however, she felt something was wrong. One evening, Daniel came home with a cold look in his eyes. He did not greet her, did not smile. Instead, he told her straight that he no longer loved her. He said he had found someone else, a younger woman who made him feel alive again. Clara froze. The words cut through her like a knife. She thought he might just be angry. But then he pointed to her suitcase sitting by the door. He had already packed her things. Shock filled her chest. She asked him, "Daniel, how could you do this to me after all these years?" But he only shrugged and said she should leave because his new woman was moving in that very night. Clara's knees went weak. She had never imagined this moment. She begged him to talk, to remember their life together. But Daniel's face stayed cold. He pushed the suitcase closer and opened the door. The sound of laughter floated in from the street, and Clara realized the other woman was waiting outside. Humiliation washed over her. She could not fight anymore. With trembling hands, she picked up her small bag and walked out. Daniel closed the door behind her without a second thought. Just like that, Clara's life was turned upside down. She stood in the cool night air, her heart heavy and her future uncertain. She walked slowly down the street, unsure where to go. The night was quiet except for the rustle of leaves in the distance. Clara had no close family nearby, and she had given up many friendships because Daniel had never liked her spending time with others. Now she had no home, no one to call, and no idea what to do. Tears blurred her vision as she dragged her suitcase along the uneven road. Every step felt heavier than the last. She thought of how much she had given to her marriage, only to be cast aside like she meant nothing. The road soon turned toward the edge of the forest. Clara did not notice where she was heading. Her mind was too full of pain. The tall trees loomed over her, their shadows long and dark in the moonlight. She felt small and lost, but she kept moving, her legs carrying her without direction. The silence of the forest wrapped around her, broken only by the distant sound of an axe striking wood. At first she thought she was imagining it, but then she heard it again, steady, strong, echoing through the night. She paused and looked around. Up ahead she saw a figure emerging from the trees. It was a man, tall and broad, carrying an axe over his shoulder. His shirt was marked with sawdust and his boots were muddy from the forest floor. His face was rugged, but his eyes were kind. Clara froze in place, unsure if she should feel afraid or relieved. The man noticed her standing there with her suitcase. He lowered his axe and walked closer, his steps calm and steady. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked in a deep, gentle voice. Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to tell him everything, but her throat tightened with emotion. The man looked at her carefully and then at the suitcase by her side. He seemed to understand without her saying a word. "My name's Ethan," he said softly. "I live in a cabin not far from here. You look like you could use a place to rest." Clara hesitated. She did not know this man, and after the betrayal she had just faced, trusting anyone felt difficult. But there was something in Ethan's voice, something steady and sincere that made her feel safe for the first time that night. She whispered, I don't know where to go." Ethan nodded as if he had expected that answer. He extended his hand, not forcing, just offering. "Come on," he said. "It's not much, but you'll be warm and you'll have a roof over your head." Clara looked at his hand, then at his face. The flickering moonlight revealed no hint of cruelty or deception. For the first time since Daniel pushed her out, she felt a spark of hope. Slowly she nodded and took a step toward him. Ethan picked up her suitcase with ease as if it weighed nothing, and motioned for her to follow. They walked along a narrow path into the forest, the trees whispering in the wind. Clara felt nervous but strangely calm at the same time. The man beside her seemed grounded like the very trees around them, strong, steady, dependable. After a short walk, they reached a small wooden cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney and warm light spilled out through the windows. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped aside for her to enter first. Inside, the cabin was simple but welcoming. The smell of pine wood filled the air, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Clara's tired eyes softened at the sight. It was not a grand house, but it felt more like a home than the cold place she had just left. Ethan set her suitcase down and handed her a blanket. "Sit by the fire," he said kindly. "You look like you've had a long day." Clara sank into a wooden chair, her body relaxing for the first time in hours. Ethan moved around the small kitchen, preparing a pot of stew. The sound of boiling broth and the smell of herbs filled the cabin. Clara watched him silently, wondering why a stranger would show her such kindness. She thought of Daniel again, how quickly he had thrown her away. The comparison made her chest ache. Ethan placed a warm bowl in front of her and smiled. "Eat," he said simply. Clara held the spoon with shaking hands and took a small bite. It was rich and hearty, warming her from the inside. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not only from sadness. They were from relief. She whispered a soft, "Thank you," her voice breaking. Ethan nodded as if no thanks were needed. He sat across from her, the firelight flickering across his face. They did not speak much, but the silence felt comfortable, not heavy. For the first time that night, Clara felt safe enough to breathe. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Clara realized she had stepped into a new chapter of her life. She did not know what the future would bring, but one thing was clear. Being cast out had led her to this cabin, to this stranger with kind eyes and strong hands. And maybe, just maybe, her story was not ending at all. It was only beginning. Clara woke up the next morning with the sound of birds outside the cabin window. For a moment she forgot where she was. She expected to hear Daniel's voice or the sound of his footsteps. But instead she heard the steady chopping of wood outside. She sat up slowly, remembering everything that had happened, the cruel words. The suitcase by the door, the long walk, and then Ethan, the lumberjack who had opened his home to her when she had nowhere else to go. For the first time in a long while she felt safe. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like a blanket, and she realized she had slept through the night without waking in fear or sadness. She stepped outside quietly. Ethan was there, swinging his axe with calm strength. The morning sun shone on his broad shoulders as he split the logs into neat pieces. He glanced at her and gave a small smile. "Good morning," he said, setting another log on the stump. Clara hesitated, then returned the smile. "Good morning," she replied softly. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, still unsure how much to say. Ethan didn't push her to talk. He simply nodded toward the cabin. "There's coffee on the stove. Help yourself." Clara went back inside and poured a cup. The smell reminded her of the mornings she used to make coffee for Daniel, except there had never been peace like this. She sipped slowly, staring into the flames of the fireplace. After a while, Ethan came in, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He poured himself a cup and sat across from her at the table. They sat in silence for a moment, only the crackle of the fire filling the room. Then Ethan spoke. "You don't have to tell me what happened," he said gently. "But if you want to talk, I'll listen." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to hold her pain inside, but his voice was steady, patient. It felt like he truly meant it. Slowly, she began to speak. She told him how Daniel had changed over the years, how she had given up her friends and dreams to support him, how she had ignored the signs of betrayal until it was too late. She didn't tell every detail, but enough for Ethan to understand the weight she carried. As she spoke, tears ran down her cheeks. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't give advice. He just listened, nodding once in a while, letting her pour out what she had been holding in for so long. When she finally stopped, embarrassed by her tears, Ethan said quietly, "You didn't deserve that." His simple words made her chest tighten again. No one had said those words to her before. Not even she had allowed herself to believe them. She looked at him, expecting judgment or pity, but his face showed neither. There was only sincerity. She whispered, "Thank you," and wiped her eyes. Ethan took another sip of coffee, then changed the subject, giving her space to breathe. "Do you know how to cook over a fire?" he asked. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "Not really," he smiled. "Then I'll teach you. Everyone should know." That afternoon, Ethan showed her how to prepare a simple stew over the open flame. Clara cut vegetables while he added herbs and stirred the pot. She found herself laughing at his dry humor when he pretended to taste the food and make a serious face, only to admit it was perfect. For the first time in weeks, she laughed without forcing it. The cabin, though small and simple, began to feel less like a stranger's house and more like a safe place. Days turned into a rhythm. Clara helped with small tasks around the cabin. She swept the floor, folded the laundry, and washed the dishes while Ethan worked outside chopping wood or repairing tools. In the evenings, they often sat by the fire. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they just sat in silence. Clara found comfort in those quiet moments. She no longer felt the pressure to prove herself or to please someone. With Ethan, she could simply exist. One evening, as the firelight flickered, Clara asked, "Don't you ever get lonely out here?" Ethan paused before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but the forest keeps me company. It's peaceful, better than noise I don't need." Clara understood what he meant. The world outside felt cruel and full of gossip. But here, surrounded by trees and silence, it was easier to breathe. She looked at him and realized he was not just strong on the outside. His strength came from within, from choosing a life that matched his heart. Ethan began to notice small changes in Clara. When she first arrived, her shoulders were heavy, and her eyes were filled with sadness. But now she smiled more. She started humming softly while she worked in the kitchen. She walked with a lighter step. She still carried pain, but she was slowly letting go of the weight Daniel had left on her. Ethan admired her resilience. He respected the way she didn't complain, the way she tried to help even though she was still healing. He never said it out loud, but he looked forward to seeing her every day. One morning, Clara decided to bake bread with what she found in the pantry. It wasn't perfect, the crust burned a little, but Ethan ate it happily. "Best bread I've had in a long time," he said with a grin. Clara laughed, knowing he was being kind, but the effort made her feel useful again. She realized she was no longer just surviving. She was living, slowly building something new in this unexpected place. Meanwhile, in town, gossip about Daniel and his new mistress spread quickly. People whispered about how she spent his money carelessly, and how Daniel was beginning to struggle to keep up. Clara heard bits of it when Ethan went into town for supplies. He never repeated the gossip in detail, but he let her know that she had nothing to regret. "You're better off without that life," he told her. Clara nodded, surprised to find she didn't feel bitterness anymore. Instead, she felt free. One evening, Clara and Ethan walked together through the forest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Clara listened to the sound of the river nearby, the birds calling to one another as the day ended. She looked at Ethan walking beside her, tall and steady, his axe resting across his back. She thought about how fate had placed him in her path that night when she had felt most alone. If she had walked down a different road, she might never have met him. The thought made her heart beat a little faster. Back at the cabin, Clara sat on the porch while Ethan stacked firewood. She felt a strange sense of peace. As if the cabin was no longer just his, it was slowly becoming hers too. She had lost everything when Daniel shut the door on her. But here, in the middle of the forest, she had found something new. It wasn't love yet, but it was something deeper: safety, kindness, and hope. She whispered to herself, maybe being thrown out was not the end. Maybe it was the beginning. That night, as she lay under the warm blanket, Clara closed her eyes and thought about the journey she had taken in just a short time. She had gone from heartbreak and humiliation to laughter and comfort. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing: Ethan's kindness had given her the courage to start again. And for the first time in years, she fell asleep with a quiet smile on her face. The days slowly turned into weeks, and Clara began to settle into a new rhythm of life at Ethan's cabin. At first, she thought she was only staying for a few nights until she figured out what to do next. But time passed, and each day made her realize she had nowhere else she wanted to be. The pain of Daniel's betrayal was still there, but it was softer now, like a wound that had begun to heal. The forest became her shelter, the cabin her home, and Ethan her quiet protector. She woke up each morning to the sound of birds or the steady rhythm of Ethan chopping wood outside. The smell of pine filled the air, and the forest looked fresh with morning dew. Clara had lived in town all her life, but she realized she had never truly seen the beauty of nature until now. She found peace in simple things: watching squirrels run across the trees, hearing the stream nearby, or feeling the cool wind on her face. Slowly, she felt herself becoming lighter, as though the forest was washing away the heaviness she had carried for years. Ethan continued with his lumber work, but he no longer did it alone. Clara often joined him. She wasn't strong enough to swing an axe the way he did, but she gathered the smaller logs, stacked the wood neatly, and kept him company. Sometimes she would bring him water or wipe the sweat from his brow with a cloth, and he would thank her with a smile that made her heart beat faster. She did not know how to explain it, but his smile made her feel seen and valued in a way Daniel's never had. In the evenings, they cooked together. Clara had always been a good cook, and she enjoyed preparing meals for Ethan. She experimented with what little they had, turning simple potatoes into crispy roasted dishes, making soups that warmed the coldest nights, and baking bread that was far better than her first attempt. Ethan teased her about the burned bread from before, and they laughed together about it. Their laughter filled the cabin and made it feel alive, not empty like it had been when she first arrived. Clara also started walking deeper into the forest, exploring trails she had never known existed. Ethan often went with her, teaching her how to recognize plants, berries, and animal tracks. She found herself fascinated by the way he knew the land so well. He told her about the seasons, how the forest changed with each one, and how he had chosen this life because it gave him freedom and peace. Clara listened closely, realizing he had built a life that many people secretly longed for but were too afraid to chase. She admired his courage. One afternoon they came across a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed in bright colors. Clara knelt to touch the petals, and Ethan stood beside her, watching quietly. She turned and smiled at him, and for a brief moment their eyes met in silence. It was not spoken, but something passed between them. Something warm, something new. Clara looked away quickly, her cheeks flushed, but the moment lingered in her heart. Meanwhile, the outside world had not forgotten her. Rumors from town traveled even into the forest. Ethan sometimes heard them when he went for supplies. People whispered that Daniel's new mistress was not as perfect as he had imagined. She was careless with money, spending on clothes, jewelry, and parties. Daniel, who had once walked with pride, was now struggling to keep up. The same people who had once admired him now shook their heads behind his back. Ethan told Clara these things gently, never to hurt her, but to let her know she was not missing anything. Clara listened calmly, surprised by her own lack of anger. She realized she no longer cared about Daniel's downfall. What mattered was that she had survived and she was beginning to live again. Clara also noticed how different her life was now. With Daniel, she had always felt judged, as if she were never enough. With Ethan, it was the opposite. She could be quiet or talkative, clumsy or skillful, and he never made her feel small. If she spilled flour on the floor while baking, he only chuckled and helped her clean. If she grew tired while carrying wood, he would take the load from her without a word. She felt respected in every small moment. It was something she had not known she was missing until now. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire as usual. Clara leaned back in her chair, tired but content. Ethan poured them both tea and asked softly, "Do you ever think about going back to town?" Clara looked at the flames for a long time before answering. "I don't know if I belong there anymore," she said honestly. "When I walk through those streets, I remember how Daniel pushed me out. I remember the looks of pity from neighbors. Here I feel different, stronger." Ethan nodded, his eyes steady on her. "Then don't go back," he said simply. His words were not a command, only an offering. Clara smiled faintly, realizing she had a choice for the first time in years. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. They still kept their own spaces, but slowly, their lives intertwined. Clara added small touches to the cabin, flowers in a vase, neatly folded blankets, a little more order to the shelves. Ethan didn't comment on it, but she noticed he left everything just as she placed it, as if he appreciated her efforts. She began to see the cabin as not just his home, but theirs. Sometimes Clara caught herself thinking of the future. She wondered if she would stay forever, if she could truly build a new life in the forest. The thought scared her, but it also excited her. She imagined seasons passing, the snow in winter, the flowers in spring, the long golden days of summer, and Ethan always there beside her. She had lost so much, but maybe she had found something better. One day, while they were stacking wood together, Clara's hand brushed against Ethan's. It was a small accident, but the warmth of his hand stayed with her. She pulled away quickly, her heart racing, and looked at him. He said nothing, only gave a quiet smile, but she could see in his eyes that he felt it too. It was a gentle reminder that something was growing between them, even if neither of them spoke it out loud. At night, when Clara lay in bed, she thought about how strange life was. If Daniel had not betrayed her, she would still be in that cold house, living a life of emptiness. It had taken heartbreak to bring her here, to this cabin, to this man. She did not know where the path would lead, but she no longer felt lost. For the first time in years, she felt that her story was hers to shape, and with Ethan nearby, she believed the future could hold something beautiful. The weeks of peace Clara had found in the cabin were like a dream compared to the life she once lived. She had begun to feel strong again, confident in her own skin and comfortable with the quiet rhythm of the forest. Each day with Ethan felt steady, filled with little joys she hadn't known she needed. But life has a way of testing people just when they start to rebuild, and Clara's strength would soon face its hardest test. It happened one afternoon when the air was heavy with the smell of rain. Clara was inside the cabin kneading dough for bread, while Ethan worked outside, repairing a broken fence near the edge of the woods. The knock on the door startled her. It was loud, sharp, and impatient. Clara wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and opened the door cautiously. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw who it was. Daniel. Her husband, or perhaps her former husband, though the papers had never been signed. He stood there looking worn and angry, but still carrying himself with the pride she remembered. His clothes were wrinkled and his eyes looked tired, but his voice carried the same arrogance as before. "Clara," he said firmly, as if he had the right to call her name. "We need to talk." For a moment Clara froze, her heart racing. Old fears tried to pull her back into the woman she once was, the one who had always bent, always obeyed, always tried to please. But then she remembered where she was. This was Ethan's cabin, her safe place, and she was no longer that weak, broken wife Daniel had pushed out into the street. Clara straightened her back and said in a calm voice, "What do you want, Daniel?" Daniel frowned at her tone, clearly not used to her speaking so firmly. "I made a mistake," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "That woman, she isn't what I thought she was. She only wanted my money, and now it's gone. Everything I built is crumbling. I can't do this alone, Clara. You need to come back with me. We can start over." Clara's stomach turned. She remembered the night he had thrown her out, the suitcase waiting by the door, his cold eyes as he shut her out of her own home. She thought of the humiliation, the tears, the way she had walked alone with nowhere to go, and now he had the nerve to stand here and ask her back, not out of love, but because his new life had failed. For a moment, anger burned in her chest, but behind the anger was something stronger. Clarity. "I don't need to go back with you," Clara said quietly but firmly. "You made your choice." Daniel's face darkened. "Don't be foolish, Clara. You're my wife. People are laughing at me already. If you stay here hiding away, they'll laugh even harder. You belong with me." At that moment, Ethan appeared from around the cabin carrying a hammer in his hand. His steady eyes took in the scene instantly. He walked up and stood beside Clara, not speaking, just placing himself firmly at her side. Clara felt the strength of his presence, and it gave her courage she didn't know she had. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he looked at Ethan. "So this is where you've been? Living with some lumberjack in the woods? This is ridiculous, Clara. Come home. This isn't your life." Clara's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin. For years she had swallowed her words, always afraid of upsetting Daniel. But now the words came clear and strong. "You're wrong. This is my life. You pushed me out when I needed you most. You chose someone else and left me standing in the street like I was nothing. But I am not nothing. I found peace here. I found respect here. And I will never go back to the way things were." Ethan didn't say a word, but he stood solid and unshaken beside her, his eyes fixed on Daniel like a silent warning. He didn't need to threaten or raise his voice. His presence alone was enough. Daniel's face twisted with anger and disbelief. He had always been the one in control, always sure Clara would bend to his will. But now, for the first time, he saw a woman who was no longer afraid of him. He glanced at Ethan again, perhaps realizing that Clara was not alone anymore. His shoulders sagged slightly. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "You think he can give you what I gave you? You're making a mistake." Clara shook her head. "The only mistake I made was believing you valued me. I regret nothing now. Leave, Daniel. There's nothing for you here." The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel opened his mouth as if to argue again, but then his eyes met Ethan's steady, unflinching gaze. For once Daniel seemed unsure of himself. With a sharp turn he walked away down the narrow path, his footsteps fading into the sound of the wind. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak and she nearly collapsed into the chair by the door. Ethan placed the hammer aside and crouched down in front of her. "You did well," he said softly. "You were strong." Clara met his eyes, tears gathering, not from sadness this time, but from relief. "I was so scared," she admitted. "But I had to say it. I couldn't let him pull me back." Ethan gave a small nod. "You didn't just say it. You meant it. That makes all the difference." That night, the cabin felt warmer than ever. Clara sat by the fire, replaying the moment in her mind. For years, Daniel had controlled her with his words and his anger, but today she had faced him and stood her ground. It felt like chains breaking inside her chest. She realized she was free, truly free, not just because Daniel had left, but because she had finally found her own voice. Ethan sat across from her, carving a piece of wood quietly. He didn't press her to talk, but his presence filled the room with comfort. Clara watched him for a moment, then said softly, "Thank you for standing by me." Ethan looked up, his eyes steady. "You didn't need me to speak for you." "You already had the strength. I just wanted you to know you weren't alone." Clara smiled through her tears. She knew then that she was no longer the woman who had been thrown out like an old coat. She was a woman who had faced the past and chosen a different path. And beside her was a man who didn't try to control her, but instead gave her the courage to be herself. When she went to bed that night, Clara lay awake for a while, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling. Her heart still raced from the confrontation, but beneath it was a deep sense of peace. She had finally closed the door on her old life. Whatever came next, it would be hers to choose. And as the sound of the forest wrapped around her, she allowed herself a hopeful thought, that this might only be the beginning of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The morning after Daniel left, Clara woke up to the sound of rain tapping gently on the roof. The storm outside was steady but not harsh, filling the cabin with a calm rhythm. She lay still for a moment, listening, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, she had stood against Daniel and refused to be broken again. She had walked through fire and survived, and now she felt something she had almost forgotten. Freedom. She rose quietly and stepped outside onto the porch. The forest glistened under the rain, every leaf shining as drops slid down. The air smelled fresh, as if the world had been washed clean. Clara closed her eyes and let the rain mist her face. It felt like a blessing, like nature itself was celebrating her courage. When she opened her eyes, she saw Ethan stacking wood under the shelter to keep it dry. He looked up at her and gave his usual small smile, the one that always made her heart settle. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Clara replied, her voice soft but steady. They shared breakfast together, simple bread, cheese, and tea. Clara found herself laughing when Ethan pretended the bread was far too hard and nearly broke his teeth on it, though she knew he was only teasing. That laughter warmed her chest more than the tea did. She realized then how much life had changed. What had started with heartbreak had led her here, to these simple but genuine moments that meant everything. As the rain cleared, the sun broke through the clouds. Clara and Ethan walked into the forest, the ground damp beneath their boots. They followed a trail along the river, where the water rushed fast from the rainfall. The trees sparkled in the sunlight, and Clara felt as if she were walking inside a painting. Ethan showed her how to spot deer tracks in the mud, and together they paused to watch a rabbit dart across the path. Clara held her breath, marveling at the beauty around her. "You know," she said quietly as they walked, "when Daniel threw me out, I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left. But now standing here, I feel like I have more than I ever did before." Ethan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes life has to strip away what's false before it can give us what's real," he said. His words stayed with her. They walked further until they reached a meadow filled with wildflowers. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying their sweet scent. Clara bent down to gather a few flowers, tying them into a small bundle. She tucked them into her hair, and Ethan chuckled softly. "You look like you belong to this place," he said. Clara smiled, touched by his words. She did feel as if the forest had claimed her, healed her, and made her whole again. Back at the cabin, Clara began adding her little touches to the home. She placed the flowers in a jar on the table, sewed patches on the old curtains, and arranged the shelves with care. Each change was small, but together they made the cabin warmer, more alive. Ethan noticed but didn't comment much. Still, Clara could see in the way he looked around that he appreciated it. Slowly, the cabin began to feel not just like his home but theirs. The townspeople soon began to notice too. On the rare occasions when Clara went into town with Ethan, people whispered and pointed. At first she felt nervous, afraid they would judge her for living with the lumberjack. But instead she heard murmurs of admiration. People saw the peace on her face, the way she walked with confidence now. Some even said she looked younger, as if the weight of years had been lifted from her. Clara realized that she no longer cared about their gossip. Her life was not for them to decide. Daniel, meanwhile, faded from her thoughts. News reached her now and then that he was still struggling, but Clara no longer reacted with pain. She had released him from her heart completely. The chapter of her life with him was closed, and she had no desire to reopen it. As summer came, Clara and Ethan grew even closer. They worked side by side, cutting wood, tending the small garden Clara had planted near the cabin, and fixing anything that needed repair. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Sometimes they spoke about their days. Other times they simply sat in silence, the sound of the forest filling the spaces between them. One evening, Clara found herself staring at Ethan as he carved a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. His strong hands moved with surprising gentleness, and the firelight danced across his face. She felt a warmth spread through her chest that was more than gratitude, more than friendship. She realized then that she was falling in love. Her heart beat faster, but she said nothing. She feared disturbing the peace they had built. But Ethan seemed to sense her thoughts. He looked up from his carving and met her eyes. For a long moment they held each other's gaze in silence. Then Ethan set the carving down and spoke softly. "Clara, you've brought life back into this place. I was fine before, but I was alone. Since you came, everything feels different, better. I never thought I'd want more than solitude, but now—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "Now I can't imagine this cabin without you." Tears filled Clara's eyes, not of sadness, but of joy. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I thought I had lost everything, but what I lost doesn't compare to what I've found here, with you." They didn't rush into grand declarations. Instead, they let their hands meet across the table, fingers intertwining naturally as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. The simplicity of the gesture spoke louder than words. From that day on, their bond deepened. They were no longer just two people sharing a roof, but two souls building a life together. They tended the garden side by side, gathered berries in the forest, and laughed at small things that only they understood. Clara began teaching Ethan some of her favorite recipes, while he taught her how to chop wood more efficiently, though she still preferred gathering smaller logs. Seasons changed. Summer gave way to autumn, and the forest turned golden and red. Clara and Ethan walked through the falling leaves, hand in hand, their hearts light. Clara realized that she was no longer defined by her past, by Daniel's cruelty or by the years she had lost. She was defined by the choices she made now, and she chose love, peace, and freedom. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Clara stood on the porch beside Ethan. The sky was painted with shades of orange and purple. She leaned against him, his arm resting around her shoulders. The cabin behind them glowed warmly, and the forest stretched endlessly before them. Clara whispered, almost to herself, "I never thought being thrown out could lead me to something so beautiful." Ethan turned his head and kissed the top of her hair gently. "Sometimes the hardest endings are the ones that lead us home," he said. Clara closed her eyes and let his words sink into her heart. She had been cast aside, humiliated, and left with nothing. But that night in the forest, when a stranger with kind eyes had stopped to help her life had changed forever. What she thought was the end had only been the beginning. And now, standing there hand in hand with Ethan, Clara knew with certainty that she had finally found what she had always deserved: love, respect, and a true home.